Hi all, welcome to Cyber Warfare Lab's AWS Cloud Red Team course. In this module, we will discuss about AWS Lambda or Lambda functions. So we will discuss about what is Lambda functions, what are components there in Lambda functions, just like API gateway, Lambda function code, how we can trigger the Lambda functions and how we can get the response, and how we can exploit the Lambda function in different phases of red teaming. So let's get started. So the first thing is introduction about Lambda function. So basically AWS Lambda is an event driven and serverless computing platform. What does it mean? That basically Lambda functions, we have a code what we are operation what to perform, so it will only consume the computation resource when we trigger these functions. If we didn't trigger it, it won't consume the computation resource. It's basically event driven. When some event is occurred, it will trigger the Lambda function and it will execute the code and it will give the result which is mentioned there in the code. It is also a serverless that will already define that serverless means it will manage the computations by itself. So when it's required, it will use the computation resources. When it doesn't require, it won't use it, which is not like a traditional. So suppose we have a traditional web applications, which is every time when it's running, it is compute or it uses the computations. But in a Lambda function, when you want to run this code, then only it will consume the computation resources. Second thing is it's a computing service that run code in response to event and automatically manage the computing resources required by the code. So it's basically we have a code. When we trigger it, it will execute it and it will all managing and all this thing done by this Lambda itself. Like all the computations resources managed by the Lambda function itself. Third one is Lambda functions code can automatically trigger from the AWS services, or we can call it directly. So how we can trigger the Lambda function, how code is executed, and how we can get the response or what other action we can perform. So we'll see in our coming section. So you can see here, suppose this is the Lambda functions. This is the Lambda functions. In Lambda function, we have this source code, which is doesn't matter what programming language you are using it. You can use Python, Ruby, or whatever programming language you have. You can use it. So this is the source code which is there in the Lambda function. Now there is a specific set of instruction defined in the source code. So how we can execute it? It is not running all the time. So we have to trigger. So when we trigger this function, it will execute it and it's used. So you can see here there is a two things. One is trigger and second thing is executing. So when we trigger this function, you can use API gateway, you can use AWS services that's called event to trigger these functions. It will execute it on a container. So it will compile and run on a container. So it will only utilize the computation resources when it's run. So after that, it will be only uses the storage. That means where the code is stored. So this is how a Lambda function, and which is really important for a for your cost saving purpose, as well as this function have a different other functionality. Now these days lot of organizations are using a serverless architecture. So they have their APIs or they have their code defined in Lambda function. So when it's required, it will execute it, but in doesn't required, it won't consume the computation resources. So this is how Lambda function look like. So there is a two things. One is trigger and second one is executing. So in this section, we will discuss about like how it's look like, how we can trigger it, how we can execute it, and where we can send the destination. So we'll discuss what other component have in this Lambda functions. Okay, so now we'll discuss about the Lambda functions. Basic idea we already know. We need to trigger this function. In the Lambda function, we have a code and it will be executed. Then what are the in-depth components there in Lambda function? So you can see a Lambda function is a piece of code that is executed whenever it is triggered by an event from an event source. So basically you can trigger by a event or APIs and all these things. So here we can get a more idea about what is Lambda function, how it's work. So you can see here we have Lambda function. So this is a Lambda function. In Lambda function we have a source code. So whatever language you have, programming language or a scripting languages like Python, Ruby, there is a source code and this is called function. We have a layers. Layers means if you have any other dependencies like any other files which is not related to your code or which is not part of your code, but there is a other dependency, you are using any third-party library, this is there in dependency section, or it's called layer. So two things is there, one is function in AWS and second one is layer. Both are the part of Lambda functions. So function we contain the source code, in layer we contain the dependencies. Now, so if you have these functions, you need to deploy these functions. Deployment is simply like you make a containerized environment which is not right now consuming any computation resources, but which only consume the storage. So when it's triggered, it will be executed. So in that state, when it's triggered, it will be executed. So here it's a deploy. Now how we can trigger it? So this is this is a requirement of a Lambda function. It is in a working state now. When it's deploy, it is in working state now. How we can trigger it? So one thing we can say is source. Source means how we can trigger these functions. So trigger happening three methods. One is synchronizes, second one is asynchronizes, and third one is stream. So we'll discuss about what is synchronous, what is asynchronous, and what is stream. So these are the three methods. Using this method we can trigger these functions. It should be there in deployment state. So once you trigger this function, it will be executed. So it will be, it's utilized one containerized environment to execute these functions. Now once it's executed, if it's a synchronous, it will send the response. Just like if we hit the API, it will give the response. But there is one more thing. Suppose there is two Lambda functions, and there is the dependency that if function 1 is triggered, that means this function is triggered, there is a requirement that other functions should be triggered. So this is called a destination. So suppose if the first function is triggered, if it is successful or failure, you can define and you can trigger another Lambda function. So you can define there in destination. You can also send a result, or you can also send this thing in your SNS, simple notification services, or you can also send this thing to SQS, simple queue services. So this is how we have two things. One is source and second one is destinations. In source we define how we can trigger it. Destination where we what we want to perform post triggeration or post execution of first Lambda functions. And this is the main function which we have, and it should be there in deployment stage. We will discuss how we can do that. So let's discuss practically how it's look like a Lambda functions. Okay, so you can see here I already logged in to my AWS management console. Let's enter Lambda. You can click on this Lambda function. Run code without thinking about the server. So basically all this thing, all server, everything is managed by AWS itself. So you can see here, this is the dashboard of Lambda functions. Currently we have 3 Lambda functions defined here. Let's see how function is look like. So let's click here the function first. You can see here right now there is this is the functions where we have to define the code. This is part of this code that we already discussed. Like here we have a function as well as layer. In function section we have a source code, in layer we have a dependency. So you can see here, when I click here in the function, it will be popped up. This will pop out and you can define the code. So currently I'm using the Python. You can define the language what you want. When you click here layers, you can define here the dependencies. So if you have any, you can add the layers whatever dependencies you have, just like any third-party library or any other libraries. Okay, so you can see here. Now let's click on the second functions. You can see here you can define the trigger as well as you can define the destinations. So basically trigger means who can trigger these functions, what are the way we can trigger these functions. So when you click here, you can see here we can trigger this function using API gateway, IoTs, CloudWatch. There's a lot more way. DynamoDB, Kinesis, S3, SNS. But when we look into the broader area, you can see you can trigger via synchronous, asynchronous, as well as the stream. So these are the three ways you can trigger it in a broader way, but in a detail you can see all this thing will come in here. So how you can trigger these functions, that's the first thing. Okay, now how we send the response and what will be the destination. So you can see here destination, you can set the destination. You can define source asynchronous invocation or stream invocation, how you send the result or invocations. When you can define the condition, if your first function, if your this functions, this is the first function, this is the conditions, if it is a failure of this function or if it's a success of this functions. So you can define the condition and you can define the destination. You can also trigger second lambda functions, or you can define the SNS topic or SQS. So this is how you can define the function, and this is how you can define the destination. So this is how lambda function is look like. You can also create a new functions. You have to define the functions. You have to define the function name ABC. Now what language you want to choose, you can choose here. So it support all languages: Java, .NET, Node.js, Python. So you can choose the language according to your need. Recently AWS introduced a new a feature where you can choose the image, container image. So if you have a container image, you can directly pick this container image and it will work as a function. So it will be executed when it's trigger. And you can also choose to take the code from a serverless app repository which is provided by AWS. You can have your own code there, or you can choose which is provided by AWS. So this is how you can create the function and you can define the function, how this function is look like. But the main thing is you can define the code here in this sections and you can define the dependencies. It is really important how we can trigger this function and where this function trigger goes. So what is the destination where we are, if it's a trigger any other function, or if it send a details or a response to any other destinations. So this is basically it's a source and a destination kind of thing. So this is how a functions or lambda function look like. Now second thing is really important about API gateway, because we understood about what is function, how we can define the code, how we can define the third-party dependencies, how we can trigger, and what are the source and how we can send the destination. So this is all about the lambda function. Now API gateway, which is a separate thing. So you can use the API gateway in lambda function, but this is completely different. You can see API gateway, Amazon API gateway is AWS service, which is a different AWS services for creating, publishing, maintaining, monitoring, and securing REST, HTTP, and WebSocket API. So basically AWS provide REST, HTTP, as well as WebSocket API. So all this thing take care by AWS, like create, publishing, maintaining, monitoring, and securing. This is the syntax of how API is look like and what are the things there in API. So you can see here, this is the format of any API call we have. This is the method. You can define the method like that: get, post, put, delete, all the operations there in methods. This is the API ID. So suppose if you create one API, there would be one unique ID assigned to your API. This will be their execute API. This is the region where your API belongs to, and Amazon AWS.com. So this is a syntax of API URL look like. Then you have a stage. Stage you can define like production, development, staging environment, or version 1, version 2. It's up to you how you can define the stage in your organizations. Then you have endpoints. That's called resources. Resource, basically you can define the endpoints. So get data, put data, delete, or whatever operation you want to perform. Then you have parameters. So here you can see I'm having a get method, so I define the parameter in this format. So if you have a post method, you can also define the parameter. So this is the syntax of API look like. You can use the API to hit or to invoke the Lambda functions. So you can see here more about the API. So this is the syntax which is API look like. You have API ID, and this will be the same execute API, and here it will be the region in which region this API belongs to. Now what we can do with APIs? So you can see here you have internet. Either you can use the AWS services, you can use the mobile application or any desktop application, or you can use IoTs to hit this API, to consume this API. These are the part of this API. API key, stage, resources, methods, API ID that we already discussed. This is the part of this API. So you want to, this is all this thing you have to use when you want to design the API, securing the API, or monitoring the APIs. Now what you can do with this API? So you can trigger. So this is the API gateway which consume all these things. Now where actually your API is stored. So suppose you can trigger the Lambda functions. You have an API. You can use this API gateway to trigger the Lambda functions. You can also trigger, suppose you have an application or API which is running on EC2 instance. You can use this API gateway feature of AWS to trigger directly to the API from there. So you can consume the API which is running there in EC2 instance. You can also use API gateway to consume the API or trigger the API which is there in your on-premises. Suppose you have an API which is there in your on-premises, you can use the API gateway. So all traffic is routed through AWS to your on-prem infrastructure. So API gateway, which is basically a gateway which protect, monitoring, detect all the malicious activity, and can improve the overall improvement using AWS API gateway. And it is really important during our red team operations, because API gateway is the first thing which will give us the initial access within the AWS environment. So suppose if any application or which is running there in EC2, or any Lambda function which is containing any APIs, if there is some web application related vulnerability or API related vulnerability, you can get the initial access on AWS accounts. So for initial access, API is really important. Why? Because without any, if there is no authentication, if there is authentication, we found SSRF or RC, how we can get all this information. And the second thing is it's directly access from internet. So you can also define that you can set this API to not need to access through internet. You can define to only access through certain VPC. This is a recent feature introduced by AWS. So you can define or you can restrict these are the API can only be accessible from the certain VPCs. But why I'm saying it's really important, because it is by default accessible, because API is used by a public audience. And if it's used by public audience, that means we can access our internet. If it's access our internet, if you found any flaw there in the code, you can misuse it. Or if you found any flaw during access these APIs, because if there is no particular authentication implemented, if there is no API key is there, or if you found the API key using any OSINT activities, this is really helpful for getting the initial access in AWS environment. You can do later other activities by misusing the Lambda function or any other AWS services. But in this case we are discussing about how we can use API, how we can misuse API to get the initial access on Lambda functions, and how we can, if you get the initial access on Lambda function or the environment of Lambda function, how we can perform a different malicious activities or in different phase of red teaming. So yeah, I think it's all clear how its APIs look like. Let's discuss it practically how it's look like. So click on the services, click on the API gateways. So you can see here, dish is the dashboard of API gateway. You can define the API gateway here. You can use your custom name as well. So these are the API. You can create a new API, but let's click on the first API. You can define whatever thing we mentioned here. We have an API ID. All this thing will be there. So this is the API and this is a unique ID of this API. You can define this is the resources. You can also define the stage, just like prod we discuss here. This is the stage. This is the reason. So how it's look like. So you can see all this thing, you will get it. This is the URL. This is the API ID. This is the execute API. It would be there, and this is a part of URL. Here you can define the region, then amazonaws.com, and you can define the prod or stage. So after the stage, you can define the resources, whatever resources is there. So these are the resources, basically endpoint. And a stage, basically for each stage there may be a different endpoint, because some stage may be for production, some is for staging environments, some is for testing purpose. But resources means we define the endpoint, what operation we want to perform, it will be there, and after that you have to define the methods. So this is a really important for all the perspectives, how it's look like and how we can define the API. So you can see this is the format of API we have, and what are other things will be there. You can also define the parameter, and here you can see when you click here, you can see here integration requests. So what is purpose of this API? So you can integrate this API to Lambda functions, your HTTP endpoint if you have, mock, other AWS services, as well as VPC link. So if you have any API on the particular VPC, you can define here. Now if I choose Lambda function, you have to define in which region the function is there and what is the function name. So all these things you can define here in API. So API and function, Lambda function, are two different services, but we can use the API to invoke the Lambda function. So here we can say it's an API gateway which will manage all these things, and actual API will be there in your Lambda function, in your on-premises, or in your, you can see in your Lambda function, in your on-premises or your private application, or the API which is running there EC2. So this is the API gateway which will manage, which will basically publishing, creating, maintaining and monitoring, as well as securing the APIs. So it also, you can define the API. So this is basically example of REST API. There is a HTTP API which is similar to this one, but you have a lesser control. In REST API you have a more control, same like we have a WebSocket APIs. So during the red team operation, you should explore all these things. What are the APIs there? How API syntaxes look like, how we can execute the API, and what API have a permission this Lambda function. When you're going for the enumeration, you will find that this is the Lambda function which the API, this is the API which have a permission to invoke this Lambda function, and this is really important for red teaming activities. So now I think we have an idea about what is API, how we can use the API, and what are the operations we can do with the API. Third component we have in our Lambda function is invocation, or we can say trigger. So basically we already know that there is a Lambda function. That means there is a code dependency and it's already there in deployment stage. How we can trigger it? So because it's an event driven, it's so once you trigger, it will be executed. It will be there in the same state, in deployment state, but once you trigger it, it will execute the code which is mentioned there in this particular functions. What are the methods you can trigger it? So there are three methods. One is synchronous, means you can send the request, you can trigger it, and it will give you the response. This is a case when you have APIs. So you can trigger it. This is API gateway. You can trigger the endpoint and the function will execute it. So this is also called synchronous or push. Second thing, we have asynchronous, where we no need to wait for the response to come. So suppose you have S3, suppose there is one functionality that if somebody upload the file on S3, this function got trigger, because this function, it will do other operation like download the file from S3, do some operations. But when some event is occur, when some situation is occur, this function got trigger, and here it's no need, it will won't send any response to S3. So basically if you upload anything on the S3, this function got trigger. Whatever code we mentions or instruction we mention, this function will be executed, but in the return it will not send any response. And it will definitely, it will not wait, because it's an asynchronous event. It will not wait for the response to come. So this is how we can trigger it. So we can use AWS services to trigger these Lambda functions. First one, we use API gateway. Second one, we use AWS services like Amazon S3 or simple notification services. Third one is stream based. So when your function is continuously streamed or triggered, so you can define this thing. Suppose if you uploading any or there is any changes there in DynamoDB, or if there is something in Amazon Kinesis, or if there is changes happening simultaneously, you can trigger directly to the AWS Lambda function. And you can also see that we can use these functions. Suppose this is the function. You can use this function to trigger any other operations. Like you can also trigger another Lambda function, or you can send response to simple queue services or simple notification services. So this is really important. Let's see how this function is look like, how we can trigger it. So let's go for a Lambda. Suppose I just click on the Lambda functions 2. This is the ARN of this functions. This is the function code. Here I define how we can trigger this function. So you can see here, this is the code I have. What it does basically, it will handle the request and it will send the response as hello from Lambda. First thing, for testing purpose, suppose if I have this event, so you can define the event, all these things. But suppose this is the event I have. If I click test, you can see the response. So the response should be look like this one. Hello from Lambda function. This is all the stage track about these functions. This is you can trigger by this is for a demo purpose, for showing how the operation is look like. But you can trigger is here. You can define the trigger how you want to trigger this function. DynamoDB, Kinesis, all these things you can mention here. So suppose if I use API gateway to trigger this function, let's see. So this is the API. You can see this is the URL which is going to trigger this function. So let's click here, copy new one. You can see here, once you trigger this function, you will get the response hello from Lambda, which is same like we did in our testing purpose. So this is how you can use API gateway, and this is why it's called synchronous, because once we send the response, it will wait for once we send the request, it will wait for the response. So this is the response we got from this one. Second thing we also mentioned, you can use S3 to trigger this function. So you have to define what is what event is happened, then this function should trigger. So suppose for the more details, suppose I trigger and I define here, I choose S3. Now which bucket, if operation is happen, you have to choose the bucket. Suppose I choose the red team 1. Now what is the event type? This is really important. What is happen this particular bucket, then this function should trigger, because if some event is happen, suppose all object create, suppose if you create any object in the bucket, this function got trigger, or if put operation is happen, post is happen, or in copy operation is happen, or delete operation is happen, this function should trigger. So you can define the type of event you want. If this type of event is happen in this S3 function, this S3 bucket, this function or this AWS Lambda function should trigger. So this is how you can define the asynchronous, because it won't send any response in the back. It will only receive the trigger, and it will execute the code which is mentioned there in the code section of Lambda function. So this is how you can define the trigger here. So this is how you can define if you have this thing, how trigger is happen. And you can also define what other operation I want to send, that in what will be the destinations. So here I define the destination. So you can choose the destination that we already discussed. On failure of this first functions or on success, what Lambda function you want to trigger. Here you have to choose the Lambda function. So currently I have 3 functions. You can choose a different function, that if first function is trigger, this second functions on this condition if met, this second function should be trigger. So this is how you can define the destinations. You can send in other way. This is a function code. You can define the code according to your need, and all this thing operation will be work. One more important thing is you can define the roles. You can define the environment variable, which is really important. Suppose this function is want to access the RDS database, you can define the username, password. You can define the environment variable here, just like username, password, database port, database host name, and all this thing. It will be there in environment variable. And second thing, by default, the role which is assigned to these functions. So there should be one execution role which is assigned to this function. If you have a role, definitely the environment variable which is not visible but in the hidden, the access key and secret will be there. So if you have a RC, you will get access of all these things. So this is really important to understand about what are the things there in these functions. You can define the runtime, you can define the tags, environment variables, and you can also define this function is a part of any VPC. So that means this function can only be triggered if there is something in part of this VPC. You can add the file system as well. So this is how you can define. You can also define the roles. So suppose in red teaming you don't have any roles allocated to you and you have a least privilege, but you found that there is one function which is have higher privilege. That means this function, if this function going to access the S3, by default this function should have a roles to access the S3. If there is a role, you can change the function code and you can access the S3 if you compromise this Lambda function. So this is really important about the Lambda functions. You can also see the permission that I already discussed, what roles it have, what policies attached to here. So you can see here this is a function. So who can access or invoke these functions? So S3, you can see S3 can invoke this function. This is the action they can do, Lambda invoke functions. There is API gateway who can also invoke these functions. So this is how you can define it. And third one is monitoring. So you can use the CloudWatch to monitor this function, but this is all this thing you will get once you have a portal access. You can monitor, or you can see in all the logs there in the CloudWatch. So when you click the CloudWatch, you can see when it's going to trigger, what request does it take, and what response it will send, and all this thing. It will be there in this log stream. So you can see here when I trigger this function, this is the request I got, and this is look like. So you can debug this thing. But from the red team perspective, it's really important, because you found that if you don't have access, but when you have access to CloudWatch, then you can download the logs, you can see what is the request is coming from, and what other things you need to do these operations. So this is how a Lambda function is look like, how we can trigger the Lambda functions, and what is the API gateway, and how we can use the API gateway to trigger these functions to misuse this thing. So this is all about how we can access the Lambda function, what are the components there. So in our next section, we will discuss about how we can enumerate all these things like policy, permissions, Lambda functions, API gateway using command line utility. Because right now I show you here in a dashboard or the using AWS portal, but suppose you don't have a credential or you don't have a access to the portal, how using the command line utility you can explore or you can enumerate all the services, basically all the components which is part of Lambda function, who can trigger this function, where it's we send, what the code is there, how we can download this code. And in other section, we'll discuss about how we can compromise this Lambda function, how we'll get the initial access, how we can create a persistency there in using the Lambda function of AWS environment, how we can escalate our privilege, how we can access more credentials. This is there in environment variable or other locations. So that will be really helpful to perform a successful red team operations in AWS environments. So this is all about this video. Thank you so much for watching this video.